Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the Provost Workshop. And today we begin the first of a series of Institute workshops on outcomes-based instruction. And I am pleased, delighted, very proud to introduce our facilitators today. So, Levelle Burr-Alexander.
Hi, everyone.
And Ron Rockland. And how are you presenting to?
Yeah.
And Howie Kimmel. I didn't see your name up there. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, at the top. I'm sorry. I can't read from this angle. You can edit that off the tape. Okay. This is a really important topic for the institution, and I look forward to a very informative session, as I'm sure you all will.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start actually the first of two sessions on outcomes-based instruction. This one will focus on learning outcomes, and I guess in September or sometime in the fall, we'll be following up with one on assessment. The two go together in making up outcomes-based instruction. Okay, what we're going to talk about today are outcomes and why they're important in terms of accreditation, but more important for our purposes in terms of accountability. We are all accountable for what we do in the classroom. We want to talk about learning outcomes, what they are, how they're written, and actually do some writing of them. We will examine some learning outcomes from existing courses and look on how we can improve existing outcomes and perhaps write new learning outcomes. And eventually we're going to talk about assessing the achievement of learning outcomes. It's one thing to have learning outcomes for students, but unless we assess whether or not the students actually achieve those outcomes, it doesn't make much sense and it's not much use. What are the key questions for planning a learning experience for students? That's what we're here for. Plan effective learning experiences for students. First thing we want to know is, what are we expecting the students to learn? Well, that's part of the curriculum. We have expectations that are part of what we're going to be teaching the students during the course. Then, once we've defined our expectations, and we're using learning outcomes to define our expectations, we want to be able to have experiences that contribute to the student acquisition of those learning outcomes. What do you have to include in terms of a learning experience for the students to be able to achieve? Then, once the students have had that experience, how do you know if they've learned? How do you know they've acquired the skills and knowledge you've defined in your expectations? How do we design the assessment to measure the learning? Well, what's the rationale for doing assessment and evaluation? You think you're a good teacher, but how do you know the students are learning? How effective are the courses that we're teaching our students? Do we really know that? And how can we, meaning us, our departments, our faculty, the university, assure the students that the material they need to have is really being taught? And how can we maintain this consistency among different people teaching the same course? We have multiple sections of some courses. Other courses are taught one semester by one faculty member, and then another faculty member may teach the course the following semester. How do we make sure that there's consistency among what's being taught? Well, if we all have the same expectations for our students, then there should be some assurance that what we're doing is consistent among everybody. And finally, we need a system that will support accreditation. ABET for engineering and for computer science, and middle states for the university. And assessment and evaluation is not just about accreditation, and this is the thing we want to emphasize most importantly. What we're really talking about is effective teaching. With or without the need to meet accreditation criteria, we should be concerned about what good and effective teaching is. And if you look at the literature, The starting point for good, effective teaching is having specified learning outcomes that the students have. They know what's expected of them. They know what skills and knowledge they're expected to achieve. And you know what skills and knowledge the students are expected to achieve. So there are 4 questions then that we look at in terms of deciding on an assessment and evaluation system. What do you want to measure first of all? You can give an exam, you can get a grade. You can grade the exam, give the students a grade. Does that tell you what they've learned? Not necessarily. So we want to know what we're going to measure, and basically what we're measuring are learning outcomes. And how are you going to measure them? Well, you're going to have to relate the work that the students produce, whether it's a report, an oral presentation, a laboratory report, some kind of laboratory experience, responding to a problem in class, or an exam. Whatever it is, we need the student work to be aligned and related to what your learning outcomes are. What criteria to use for success? How do we know, how do we define whether or not the student has actually achieved that skill and knowledge you're defining? And what action items are necessary to demonstrate the student's level of achievement? Now, this is a matter of assessment. This is something that we're not going to focus on today. We'll be focusing primarily on the learning outcomes that would be assessed. And then in the fall, there'll be a second workshop which focuses on the assessment process. So we're only covering the first 2 questions, really, in this workshop. Now, just to look at what the accreditation agencies require, and they're both very similar. For the middle states, they're looking at a teaching learning assessment cycle, which should include the learning outcomes, courses, program, and experiences that provide opportunities for students to achieve those learning outcomes, and then being able to assess the student achievement of these outcomes. And something that has really come about once we started looking at the criteria for accreditation. Continuous program improvement. It's not a matter of just assessing the students. It's a matter of using the results of that assessment to look at what you're doing. If you find that students are not acquiring skills and knowledge that you expect them to, then you have to look at why. Is it your teaching strategy? Is it a textbook? Is it supplementary material? Whatever. You've got to try something different. ABET has the same, basically is saying the same thing. The focus is on continuous program improvement. Point is effective teaching. You want to find out how effective your teaching is, and then where you find there's a problem with what you're teaching, you want to find a way to improve it. So they both require specifications of student learning. They both require the opportunities for students to achieve the learning outcomes. And they both require the assessment data that will allow you to make improvements in student learning and your teaching. Now, there are different levels of outcomes. There are outcomes that are specified by the accreditation agency. Then there are outcomes for a given program, whether it's a BS degree in chemical engineering or a BS degree in biology or a BS degree in economics. You have outcomes for that program. By the time the students graduate and complete your program, there are certain things that their future employer will expect them to have. Now, within the program then, there are a series of courses that students are enrolled in which they're supposed to be learning. Well, those outcomes are for each individual course. And the outcomes of each course should lead then to the students achieving the outcomes for the program in which they're enrolled. So the subset of program outcomes is, of course, learning outcomes. Within the course learning outcomes, then, you have learning outcomes for students. These are outcomes within the course that are defining skills and knowledge a student should be acquiring as you go through the material in the course. what I've just been saying, it can be seen very simply in this flow chart. So you start with program outcomes, course learning, student learning, and your instruction, and it's a cycle so that you're always assessing and you're providing the documentation on whether the students are achieving or not, and you're making changes as necessary to improve teaching where needed. So student learning and assessment has to be an ongoing process. It's not a discrete process, as some do. We have to make sure students have the opportunities to process the learning, not only learn it, but process the learning that's taking place during an instructional session. We can't have this. I taught Stripe how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him, I didn't say he learned it. That is a problem at all levels of education. And with this, I think Levelle will come in and continue us with connecting classroom practices with outcomes.
So now you have the outcomes prepared, your learning outcomes prepared, and now it comes into connecting it to what's happening in the classroom. And that's your instructional practice. So the purpose is that you're really going to be facilitating a shift in your thinking. Now maybe some of you are already there, but the shift is from being instructor focused to being student focused. For example, sometimes instructors will say something about the process of what they're going to do. But no, this is focusing on the student. So, and you're making sure that you're covering all the materials and that you have defined all of those skills and knowledge that the student should acquire at the end or as an outcome of the course. Because right now we're going to focus more on course, okay, the course perspective. And then you also need to, hopefully you're using this for feedback for assessment of your instruction as well as for the student learning, for students to learn. That's the continuous, that's the feedback. So for the student achievement piece, you know, you really want to give feedback to the students on how they're doing in terms of those learning outcomes that are defined to the students at the front end of the course. So that's really something that I think we're working towards, having it at the front end on the syllabus, for example. And then the next thing is that the outcomes are not mandating your instruction, what's instructional strategy you're going to use or instructional practice. It's not specifying a book, a curriculum. It's for the outcome of the student. So there's an article called The Language of Assessment, and these are some tips by somebody by the name of Gloria Rogers. And so she has talked about objectives, but we're talking about outcomes here. And this is an example of a student outcome. So the students will describe what is expected to know and to be able to do by the time of graduation. And then you're going to have to determine some sort of performance indicator. What is going to be your level of performance, your expectations for students in order to achieve the outcome that you want to achieve. And then you're going to figure out how you're going to collect information, not only for you to see how the student is doing, but also for the student to measure where they are in the process. And then you're going to hopefully do some evaluation, process all of this information, which is, you know, traditionally, I guess that would be their grade, so to speak.
Well, just to point out, the reason for this chart is because there's a lot of confusion in terms of the terminology. And ABET is part of the reason for confusion. She wrote this article, this table, simply to try to get people to understand the differences between the different terminologies.
People use assessment and evaluation interchangeably. People use outcomes and objectives interchangeably. And the outcomes are the end result. So the whole purpose of this is to make sure that students are learning effectively that they know exactly what it is that they're expected to learn at the end of the course or at the end of a unit, and that students are able to kind of put their learning in context of their overall course. So how does this benefit the instructor? Again, your learning outcomes are student-centered, but you have a benefit from the information in the learning outcomes and also student work, your evidence that students are meeting those learning outcomes. So first of all, you know exactly what the students are expected to learn from your own course. You also will be able to design your materials and learning experiences more effectively. Because if you have a learning outcome, you're giving a learning experience, and you have some sort of materials that you want to use so that students will have the outcome that you stated for your course. And then you need to select appropriate teaching styles. Colleges are infamous for more of a lecture style. And so, but you might want to think about varying, you know, as in the academic world, especially at the college level, you usually don't have any courses on instruction. Okay? So it's good to build a repertoire of a variety of teaching styles. And then you want to make sure that your instruction is effective. Because sometimes it has nothing at all to do with the content. It might be the delivery. For whatever reason, students just aren't getting the concepts. And then you want to make sure, from your perspective, that the assessment strategies are actually used. So for example, to assist in the writing exam questions based on your learning outcomes. So in other words, if you have a learning outcome and you're not assessing it, then that's not really an effective kind of continuous improvement cycle for not only the student, but also for you as the instructor. So what is a learning outcome? It's really looking at achievable work from the student that can be documented in their work products. Okay? So the outcome is something that's achievable by the students and documented through each student's work that can then be evaluated by you, the instructor, or if you have the peer, sometimes you use peer evaluation. Okay? Now the learning outcomes have, we encourage a four-part learning objective. Learning outcome, I'm sorry. Learning outcome. And the first part are the behavioral verbs. That's the action that you want students to have done and can do at the end of your course. And these indicate and communicate to others, not only you, not only the student, but also as you collectively bring all your courses together for the program, and then the programs bring collectively for the university, so everybody knows it's specific. It needs to be observable behavior. There's observable behavior relative to the skills and knowledge. And they describe so that you can make inferences about the student learning. This slide here is to show you once was the typical way of wording learning outcomes, which is the not column. This is not good. You will see a lot in the literature. Students to know, to understand. How do you know what it is that they know? What's the action that the students are going to do for know? You can't measure know. You can't observe know. But if you learning outcome says to state, to identify, differentiate, compare, these are more observable behaviors or actions that the students can do, and this is your first part of your learning objective, and that's the observable behavior. So that first part, again, is the action or behavior. It needs to be observable performance. Remember I told you there are 4 parts. The second part is the specific skills and knowledge. this is not the topic, not the broad topic, but the actual skills and knowledge. And we have some slides on that in a few. The next is your level of achievement, called the performance indicators. It's really difficult to meet an outcome if you don't know what you're shooting for. If you don't communicate to the students what you're expecting as an outcome of this course or this lesson or unit, whatever you want, chapter. And then the next thing is you need to, in your learning outcome, all three components also give an indication through what student work are they going to give you that you can then determine whether or not they've met your level of mastery or achievement, the skills and knowledge. Am I okay with time?
You're fine.
Okay. All right. This is an example of a course that is called Fundamentals of Chemistry. This is not a well-written outcome. Okay, this is an example of an outcome that is not well-written. So students can learn at a pace more suited to their ability. They can assist. They are assisted to gain at least a minimal competence in chemistry. That doesn't tell you a whole lot. Students will acquire the necessary skills. Again, too broad and is difficult to, as an observable performance, of acquire. Another example, Fundamentals of Engineering Design. Again, this is an example of not how to write a learning outcome. Students will learn the dynamics of team effort, leadership, scheduling, cooperation, responsibility, conflict resolution. What does that mean? Learn the dynamics. What skills and knowledge is embedded in your word of dynamics? One more I'll just read. Students will learn from the modules and give faculty suggestions for curriculum reform. Is that students focused? Does that sound student focused in terms of the behavior of the skills and knowledge they're going to come out with? You have no idea what this word module. One more example for economics course. We were trying to get different disciplines in our example. Again, how not to write your learning outcome. I'll just do one from here. Students will appear the portfolio. So they will maintain a portfolio of their work, and the portfolio will have the following evidence. For example, they will have written papers, drafting them before preparing final copies. Well, that's a pretty, hopefully there's more to this learning outcome than this simple statement about maintaining a portfolio, because the learning that they're getting from your course is much more than the portfolio. Oh, okay. And for the students have made an oral presentations in class. Oh, so that the student has made oral presentations in class. Okay, so they made oral presentation. You know, that's again not descriptive enough of the skills and knowledge.
What I want to talk about is an example, hopefully, of what to do now. I teach several courses in electrical and computer engineering technology. One of them is ECT 300. And among the major topics are technique called Laplace transforms. Also teach a little about MATLAB, a computer application. And if you use the wrong way of doing it, I could have written things like students will understand Laplace transforms, or students will understand MATLAB. Again, what does that mean? So that's what I don't want to do. And spent a lot of time, probably over 2-3 years ago, in preparation for ABET, started to really tear apart this and all the other courses that we have in at least 4 of the options in engineering technology that are ABET accredited. These are the outcomes that came up with, and these are just a few. Students will use Laplace transforms to solve various RLC, resistive, inductive, capacitive circuit problems. Why is that good? It's saying what they're going to do, what action, but it also would lead me to identify the kind of student work, whether it be a homework example, a test example, or both, that I can use to assess. Students will demonstrate the proper use of MATLAB to perform data analysis and graphing to solve technical problems. Now, I'm not saying we'll solve this specific problem. It's broad enough to allow me to identify a series of homework, labs, etc. It's an outcome. Students understand what they should know at the end of the course. I understand what I need to do. And one of the keys that we probably haven't talked about is with learning outcomes that you can also tie a learning outcome like this, which may be a prerequisite, to the next course. Well, guess what? Learning outcomes should match. Now, in terms of relating to student work, what I did, and you have a sheet there, that I created actually 11 learning outcomes for this course. There's no magical number. Probably 1 is not a good number. 25 is an overkill. And again, what I then did is tie in student work to provide assessment. What I'm not showing, or will be showing in the fall, is going one step further and what are the performance indicators based on that student work, and then even going further, what are what we call cut scores that are acceptable performance and not, that may lead me to do continuous improvement. They all tie together. It starts with learning outcomes. Again, let me take a look at this sheet. This looks like an old spreadsheet there. You have the sheet so you actually can see some detail. But if you... No. Okay. I have good eyesight. But if you look here, again, demonstrate the proper use of MATLAB to perform data analysis and graphing to solve technical problems. Here is a MATLAB example. This is the first MATLAB example. So this is what I'm going to be using to assess that learning outcome. It's not enough just to have them. You need to be able to assess them. And then again, carry forward in our next workshop, what I need is to set a performance indicator for that and actually evaluate that. If you take a look, all the learning outcomes are related to something, whether it be a test question, doesn't have to be a whole test, or a homework, or some other example. I'm tying it all together. I know that either the students will achieve these learning outcomes, or perhaps they don't, and if they don't, then I need to start relooking at the course. If I didn't have learning outcomes, I would be able to know how effective. I said, gee, I teach a great course, but I don't know that. That's the essence of what learning outcomes are about. This was something, and Eliza, you're in terms of Math 111, okay? And I want to take a look at it, not to, to basically help. Students will demonstrate mastery of topics such as limits, blah, blah, blah. And you can read some of these will demonstrate mastery, demonstrate ability. I guess the question I would have is, having gone through this, toss it back, I like active learning. What are your comments on this? What? What are your comments on these as learning outcomes now that we've gone through some slides? Are they good? Do they need modification, changes?
I think they're still very general.
They're still very general.
If you talk about your example from the ECET 300, we are playing the student learned MATLAB with a statement that to solve technical problems. Technical problems is such a, at least for me, a general term that I don't really know what. I feel like I had one something that was general, the place was something more general, also general.
Right.
So I would look for something more specific because what does mean the student learn some technical problems? And the same various RLC trigger problems.
Okay, so you're going back here.
Yeah, between ECET 300, you see it, this one.
Right, that
So
one.
for me, it's kind of one black box replaces another black box. It's not too much more.
Yeah.
For me.
Well, the key here, okay, and you have to say what you want to do. There's a fine line between being too general and sometimes almost being too specific. I want to have the latitude, if I'm not teaching, if someone else is teaching, for them, they can design their own problems. I don't want to say they will be able to use the class to solve problems 5, 4, and 5, 5 of the textbook. There should be some latitude. What demonstrates the ability to do that, which is a good portion of 2 chapters, is going to be, I'm going to determine on terms of the assessment. So you do want to have some generality in terms of your learning outcomes, but you do want to have the ability to say they're leading me to some assessment piece.
Yeah, I think there's a big thing between their generality and being specific. For example, the math outcomes that you showed, I thought that they're extremely detailed, too detailed. I wanted to write as an objective and a goal to learn how to differentiate.
Right.
And the reason is just that. And the reason is because that's what calculus 1 is. However, after discussion and we told the little states and so on, we wrote that, which is really the topics that they need to know. Having a student coming into the class, understanding and engaging, I don't know if the limit will engage them. What we have, and I think it is very relevant to what you have, is to expand about a lot of software packages to develop an understanding and so
Right.
on. I think that's complete.
Yeah, I will tell you one thing from the experience that I did in my course and helping faculty in some of the other options for AVET. It is not a simple process. It is an iterative process where, gee, I wrote something and I let Howard and Levelle look at it, and did it again. Finally, begins to get a little better understanding. You have to do it several times, like you would expect your students to do.
But the thing is, when we design a new course, which recently happened in biology,
Right.
we write the learning outcomes often before we've even taught the course. And I agree with you, over time
Yeah.
you're going to develop experience with that particular course
Yeah.
and see what works, what doesn't work. So we'll have on file learning outcomes where we're essentially just, model what might happen, and then later on, after a few years of teaching, you have a much better...
Learn. I mean, and that's the whole process of continuous improvement. No one says the outcomes themselves have to be stagnant. You can modify those, but if you're developing a new course, you should have some expectation of what students at the end of the course will have understanding of in terms of,
No, I agree 100% with you, but I'm talking. We sort of worried. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons for this, obviously, we want to teach more effectively. But there's also this accreditation, things like that. So what we'll have on file won't necessarily reflect what we're currently teaching.
Well,
and is there a mechanism to submit just the learning outcomes and just say, okay, we've actually modified these over time?
But understand again, from accreditation, or as I say, forget accreditation. Think about teaching. I'm creating a new course. What do I expect students in terms of skills and knowledge to learn? How do I know? Those are the key elements. I want student learning. But what are those skills and knowledge? It's not just they'll understand Laplace transforms. I really have to dig deeper in what do I really expect. And if I have a list that satisfies me as the creator of the course or whoever's the course coordinator, then I have a better course in terms of knowing what it is. Then I go in and say, okay, here are my tests, labs, essays, whatever, and lo and behold, I have 3 outcomes, and I can't find any way of assessing. What do I need to do? I need to revise the test. I need to add some sort of assessment. So it becomes a continuous improvement process, but what's going to do is improve the course so that students learn more. That's really what it is.
I have a question. In the table that we discussed that was presented earlier about objectives, outcomes, and the language of assessment, when we talk about the capstone course 400 level, 800 level, we understand that we can talk about the objectives defined as statements that describe the expected accomplishments of graduates during which was given to us, is what it is.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about a 100 level course, I don't think we can write what we expect the student to achieve 1 year after they graduate.
Well, okay, here, let me just explain something. What we're talking about here, for the most part, is course learning outcomes. I use that in the accreditation for mine, CLOs, course learning outcomes. they build up to program outcomes, which eventually will build up to the university level in middle states. But it starts with a course. At a freshman course, you can define what skills and knowledge a student should have at the end of that freshman course.
Let me just point out, when I started working with faculty, for example, in chemical engineering with the ABET, that had the ABET division, one thing I found about faculty is they felt that for each course, they had to list every one of the outcomes that ABET lists for that course. Even if they're not relevant, they still had to list every outcome. No one course is going to meet every outcome. A freshman course does not necessarily have to meet certain outcomes that are more readily going to come out of a junior or senior level course.
And it's going to be different.
You should be defining learning outcomes, not to meet accreditation criteria.
So this objectives does not apply. I'm just saying, I would look at the language.
Yeah, well, but again, let me talk about courses rather than programs. A course objective is what you want to accomplish looking at the beginning of the course. A course learning outcome is what students have the knowledge of at the end of the course, as a result of that course. So if you have a 100 level course, Math 111, what is the expectation at the end of that course that students should have? What skills or knowledge should they have? And if I just hold on 1 second, let me just go to this next slide. Actually, I'm going to go straight here. Here's an example from another university, for name names, but it's in Hoboken.
And it's not exactly as they wrote it.
Right, we rewrote it a little bit. Limits. Students will be able to explain the concept of a limit. Now, where is that going to be? Maybe a test, maybe a homework assignment. Students will evaluate an example of a determined form. Derivatives. Students will be able to state the fundamental definition of a derivative. That could be a test. That could be a homework assignment. That could be a number of things. But you see the difference between here and here. That's what we're trying to associate. And again, it's a process. But if I go back to here, I can look at the things, and this is only part of a list. I think there were about 10 to 12, maybe 12 different learning outcomes for this course. Blake? Yeah.
I was just going to state the condition is a key part to any learning objective or outcome. And you write that more, or the way you write that is going to vary depending upon the level of the class. If you use your level classes, that condition should be easier to meet.
Right.
As it gets more difficult, it's more complex.
There's no magic formula for writing a learning. There's no magic formula. You have to decide what is it that you want your students to learn during the semester. What knowledge, what content are they supposed to be learning? And you want to be able to write the learning outcome in such a way that you have a method to assess whether or not they've achieved that learning outcome. And it's not all going to be done in one semester. You can do a first run. You're going to find problems either in the way you're defining the learning outcome or whether or not the students are able to acquire that skill and knowledge.
Yeah.
It's an iterative, as Ron said, it's an iterative process. Right. It may take several times before you get it. But the point, it's not just for your effective teaching, it's for others who may teach your course or people who are teaching that same course at the same time. And it's the students who know what it is you expect them to learn.
And this is a course I've been teaching for almost 15 years. I didn't have all these for the first 10, 12 years. I had some ideas, I had some more objectives. It took a while to teach to understand that, yes, these are the things. And as I go through each year and teach it, I'm going to relook at some of those, and maybe there's an outcome that I don't achieve. There's an outcome that I can't get to, and I may take that out because there's no sense putting it in. But there may be another outcome that I realize could be an offshoot of that. I'm not going to have 30 of them, but I'm not going to have just one, which is understand Laplace transforms.
Yeah, so this is coming back to my earlier question about updating every year in the iterative process. You said, should we add the learning outcomes to the syllabus, have the regular syllabus?
No,
which is
very good question.
And then at the end, have the most of the things you should learn.
In engineering technology, for the 4 options, and within the next 2 years for all our options, all our syllabi have learning outcomes. If you look at my syllabus, it has these learning outcomes right there. So a student goes into the class, okay, here are the topics, here's the week by week, but they're looking at that. I don't have this schedule there, but they are looking at that, and they know exactly what they should be, what skill and knowledge they should have when the course is complete. And I think that's fair to the students. It's fair to you, too.
Now, the first time you're going through a course, you may not write them all at the beginning. You may be doing them as you go along. But as long as you're giving the students your expectations before you start on a given topic, then the students have an understanding of what it is they're supposed to be learning from what you're talking about, from the textbook, from whatever.
And the thing that I learned by doing something like this was that, I actually added an assignment because here I had a learning outcome, and I realized I was not assessing it. The typical, long time ago, someone was saying I gave a lecture in ethics, and the question is, well, the students learn it. Oh, well, it was a great lecture in ethics. Same thing as a cartoon. He said exactly the same thing. How do you know the students learn it? Did you give them a essay? Did you give them a case study? So challenge yourself is that if I can identify, and understanding ethics is not it would be something, we're using those words, but if I have that, do I have a means of assessing? If you have what the learning outcomes are, and you have the means of assessing, you're well on a way of teaching, knowing that your students are learning. Forget about, I'll put the thing, ABEG, forget about middle states. This is about us teaching. That's the key. Sure.
I think it's really funny, Andrew, because Andrew already did this for information literacy, and he did it very well. The outcomes were supplied through that overall plan, and then what you did when you did your assessment summary for information literacy was exactly that. You looked at, how did we address those outcomes, and how did we do? And then, next semester maybe you'll change what you're doing. You already actually did that report, so I think it's the same thing. It's just now for your outcomes for your own, your other outcomes for your course.
And communicating them to the students. That's important. So it's not stored in your desk or on your computer, that you're communicating it to the student.
Now, one strategy you could use as you're doing it, if you want to, get a colleague who knows the same material or teaches the same material you're doing. Have that colleague look at the outcomes and see if they make sense to him or her, whether that person can figure out how to assess that learning outcome. That'll help you in terms of determining whether it's well written as an outcome.
Now, with that, being an active learning, we have an assignment now, in class assignment for you for just a few minutes. We'll see. Think about a course you're teaching now, preferred, or a course you previously taught. Select an important concept from the course, specify the concept. So that's how you start with learning, what concept I learned. And then use the sheets that you have there, those 4 things, try to write a learning outcome, and then we'll pick a few people at random, like I do in my class, and just talk about it.
Ron, can I explain the other handouts that we're
Sure.
helping? For this part of the activity, you should have 3 handouts. One is entitled, well, I'll start with this one. The definition of behavioral verbs for learning. Actually, I should have changed that to outcomes. That's supposed to be outcomes. So these are example of action verbs, the behavioral verbs, and a definition. Examples. It's not an exhaustive list. All right? It's this sheet here that has at the top Dr. Kislik. Okay? This is not ours. This is Dr. Kislik. Okay? Examples of some behavioral or action verbs. Okay? It's a double-sided document. Okay? The other document that you should have is another two-sided document that has 3 columns on the front and 3 columns on the back side. How many of you have heard of Benjamin Bloom? Not Joel Bloom, Benjamin Bloom.
Bloom's taxonomy?
Okay. Bloom's taxonomy, back in the late 60s, Benjamin Bloom, who's an educator, came up with what he called levels of critical thinking or learning. And it's pyramid shaped. So the lower level skills would be in the level of knowledge. Students will just recall information. That's when, they might spit out something. They didn't really, you had them to put something in, rank order, or you had them to write a definition of a word. Okay, that's pretty low order. They don't have to do a lot of thinking with that. As you progress from the comprehension stage, then maybe you might have them to restate a definition that's in the book. See the difference? One, just giving them the word and having them to write the definition from the book, as opposed to having them to restate the definition. That's a little higher up there. The next level is application. Again, we're going up the pyramid. Is maybe they have to write a short paragraph that interprets that definition, or have them to prepare their own definition. Again, bringing them higher up in their learning. And then if you flip it to the back, then the analysis stage, the synthesis stage, and the highest level is the evaluation stage. Now, the evaluation stage is the student will able to use their thinking and their learning to evaluate, to appraise, to compare and contrast. They will be able to assess on their own or make predictions. Okay? So does everyone understand, have a kind of understanding of this? All right. And then the other document is a colorful document that has 4 columns on it. At the very bottom, that's a good idea. Okay. At the very bottom is the 4 parts of the learning outcome. So the behavioral verb and the specific skills and knowledge is where we're going to stop today. And then the last 2 are what we're going to cover in part 2 of this workshop. Okay? So when Ron asks you to think about one of your courses, think about a skill and knowledge. Okay? Not a broad stroke, a skill and knowledge. And you could use the example from the other university, which my slides, I don't know which slide that's on. That was the one on the from the other university where we had examples from other universities. Students are able to, and there's limits bullet, a derivatives bullet, an application to real world environments. Okay, that's an example of what we want you to think about for your own course. Okay, and the skill and knowledge would go in this box. Or you might have a whole list of them. Your chart has many more lines on it. So I want you to think about maybe 1 or 2 examples of a skill and knowledge. Right now, this is a hands-on part. Okay, think of a skill and knowledge, either 1 or 2 examples of skills and knowledge from your course. And then
5 minutes.
Okay, and then we would like you to then pick some sort of action or behavioral verb that you're going to have the students to do to acquire that skill and knowledge so that they have an outcome for that skill and knowledge. Just one. Let's just start with one since we only have 5 minutes.